Here is an orange ink by Sailor, Studio 573.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
Frequently a dull, flat orange that reminds me of orange sherbet. It's being a dull, dusty tone isn't itself a bad thing, just not a bright orange like I'm used to seeing more frequently. Certainly doesn't draw attention away from other writing when used as a second color on the page, but it is strong enough to stand alone on the page, even though it's much lighter. It's not hard on your eyes to read it. There's a slight tone variation by pen, and it does shade very nicely. It is only that I have an orange ink that I really love that I'm not attracted to this one. It's certainly different than every other orange that I've tried in that it's this dull, dusty orange, which makes it really unique.
The pen for today is a Platinum 3776. All of the writing samples are done with
a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get to see the lightest tone we're really going to see here, and you see it's still easy to read, even though it's much lighter. Now, we get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get some shading throughout. Now, there's some spots that shade very dark, but for the most part, it's going from its lighter tone to its mid-tone, like you see on They on the second line, or Mountains on the third line. You see it shifting in colors, not a huge amount, but definitely giving some shading. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the extra fine. We get no feathering, no spread, a very nice shading throughout it. It's really showing that it does have some darker and lighter tones, and it shows up very regularly, which is nice. I really appreciate that it is a lighter orange, that it's not, bright and screaming, which tends to be the orange that I like the most. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. We get no feather, we get no spread. We get shading, and a very nice shading. The stub is doing a great job at bringing it out with that squeegee-like action that the nib does. It's really there. Now, the H on Sunlight is much darker, which was really a me writing thing, much more than the ink. Typically, what you get to see is like on sides on the second line, or brown on the second line. Each word really lighter and darker tones, and shifting in and out of it nicely. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get the same tone as on the Clairfontaine. It's not flattening at all because it is already a nice, flat, dusty tone. No feather, no spread, being very well behaved, giving us a little bit of shading in there. You see it in a bilbo, voice, with, all down the left side. You see it in the middle. You see it everywhere. Really. Always love seeing shading. Come on, I haven't really gushed on it in a while, but it's shading so well. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the extra fine. A tad bit darker than it is on the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread, still some very nice shading going on. I really like this. I think what I'm seeing right here, just a little better than on the Clairfontaine. Even though the tone is the same, on this paper, I think it's just showing a little nicer. Looking at the stub nib. It's not a broad, that's a stub. It's got the same tone as the medium, the same tone as on Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get nice shading throughout. Not huge amounts, not like it's a camouflage shading that I really love to see, but we're getting very nice shading that draws your eye to specific spots. Look at Misty Mountains, third line, really. Right there is the spot that I'm seeing the most as I'm looking at this writing. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Very well behaved.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. A little, I want to call it a little more vivid here as a result of the tone of the paper. We get no feathering, we get no spreading. The shading is definitely showing itself better here than it did on the other two papers. And I think it's kind of a trick the eye plays with this paper, or the slightly more absorbent nature of this paper is really working to the benefit of this ink. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. It is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get really nice shading all the way through. And at this point, I kind of have to comment, while it looks really nice, the color of this ink on this tone paper isn't something that I see and say, I want. It's distracting to me. Even though the ink is performing better, the tone of the paper with the tone of the ink doesn't make it read as easily for me. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get very good shading. Though we are getting a little bit more of its lighter tones, we're getting the same tones that we had in both of those other writings. Again, I'm dealing with the issue that it is not as comfortable to read on the page as it is on white paper. The tone paper for this ink, I just don't think is a best way to go. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and no problems whatsoever.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We get less shading than we had on the Clairfontaine. Though it is shading, you certainly see it in comfortable and in chair. Look at how dark the H is compared to the letters around it. On the second line, you see it in his, where it's shading very nicely. And favorite starts light and works its way to its darker tone, doing a very nice job. Looking Looking at the medium nib, it is slightly darker than it was with the extra fine, a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Bit surprised by that, but it's what I'm seeing. With no feather, no spread, yes, it does shade, and it is shading very, very well. It's shading just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, and while the tone is a little bit lighter in general than the Clairfontaine, I think the shading shows nicer here. Looking at the stub nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the medium, a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get shading. Again, we're getting shading very well, but not as well as on the Clairfontaine. Now, while it's not shading as well as on the Clairfontaine, I think it's showing it better, and I know that's really weird to say. The spots that are shading are certainly drawing more attention than they did on the Clairfontaine, though it's not doing it as frequently. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and have no problems.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Bookbinder's Everglades Rat Snake. Here is Diamine Blaze Orange. Here is Monteverde Motivation. Here is Robert Oster Tangerine. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we have the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Talk about consistent as an ink. Wow. No feather, no spread, almost no shading. The paper's really making it go away. This, again, I'm going to come back to the fact that this is like a dusty orange. When papers would normally kind of tone it down some, this ink is winning because that feature of the paper isn't really affecting the ink, so you get a really nice, consistent performance. Looking at the medium nib, it is only a tad bit darker than it was with the extra fine, a little lighter than we're getting on the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread, but we do get some shading. Little bits of shading, just sprinkled here and there, especially if you back up over an area like where on the second line when I went there, you see the H where I fixed it. It's a horrible word. Don't try and read what I put there, but look at it, and you see it got much darker. It shows that it can shade, though it's not really shading a ton on this paper. It's really being lost in the majority of it. Looking at the stub nib, it is a tad bit darker than it was with the medium, a bit lighter than we're getting on the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we do get shading. The stub is really working to its benefit on this paper. You see quite a bit of it. Now, the very interesting thing is if you look at May, first word, right side of the Y, there's a little bit of a halo, which is strange, but it is there. I like what I'm seeing. I do wish I saw some more shading, but this paper doesn't tend to shade a ton. Do I think you could use it here? Yes. I don't think this goes as a primary color on the paper. As a secondary, adding to your notes, absolutely. Just in this case, I don't think it stands alone well. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we have no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a blue ink by Montegrappa Blue. Here is a brown ink by Montegrappa Coffee Brown. Here is a green ink by Montegrappa Green. Here is a purple ink by Montegrappa Violet. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather. It does spread. Not all the way up to a medium, more like a medium fine. The feather and the spread well under control, as in it's not something that's going to stop you from using it. It's not a problem, but it is there. It does even give little bits of shading, which I was surprised by. I mean, you see it in message and in by, you see it in expected, you see it slightly in comforting. It's there. It's just not tons, but it is copy paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the extra fine. It is a little darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. Nah, we get feather, we get spread. Take a look at it. Not great, not horrible, not great. It all has tiny little bits of feathering. It spreads almost up to a broad, but the feathering and the spread, the feathering's a little distracting to me, and it's really drawing where it was darkest. That first word, it, for some reason, my eye goes straight there and is not liking it. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone as the medium, little lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. Now we get some feathering. You see it in trees, you see it in Beano, and you see it in hills. You see it in every word, and it's not the end of the world. Once again, this is copy paper. You do get a little bit of spread, which is going to close up some of your letters while you're writing, but I tend to sort of have that problem myself in general. So I'm not calling it as a problem for me, but there is a little bit of spread. There's a little bit of shading that does go on, but it's not like what you see for the shading is any kind of a standout feature. Looking at the page underneath, there was one dot that came through, touched the page underneath with the medium nib. That wouldn't stop most people from having this used on this paper. It wouldn't stop me anymore, and it might, but that wouldn't. Back of the page, you see there's quite a bit of ghosting. You probably couldn't write on the back and be able to read both sides comfortably, but you can, without any problem, not worry about truly corrupting the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
I think looking at the lighter tone of this and it being just how it kind of looks, it's a unique look about this ink, that a dry pen is going to be a bad choice here. It's just going to make it unappealing to look at. For my taste, I would go for a wet stub. The slightly darker tone and combined with the shading that you could get is really very pleasing on the eye and takes this from being what would be a great complementing color on the page to being a really nice primary color on the page for your writing.
This is the end, and thanks for watching.